Thanks for tuning into the Marriage is Tougher Than Woodpecker Lives podcast. This is Paul, alongside my co-host Brian. We'd like to welcome you to a community meant for the men of the world to share our thoughts and perspectives on marriage. We can learn from each other's experiences and help each other be better husbands. So today's episode, we're going to talk about relationship development versus personal development. And if you develop on your own, it may not serve the needs of your marriage.
And we'd also like to invite you to link up with us on our social medias. Searching Marriage is Tougher, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. You can also hit us up on our website, marriageistuffer.com. If you'd like to be a guest, there's a short form for you to fill out there where we can ask you a couple questions and then qualify you to be on the show. Also, all of our episodes are archived there. So if you'd like to listen and re-listen, which would, in our opinion, help you learn, then you can do that there. Outside of that, if you would like to add any value to the podcast or to the community, do that on Instagram. Post your questions there. Just engage. That's all we're asking. But let's get right into this episode.
All right, B. We're talking about development today. And I know our mindsets around development is you need to do it. It's not an option. It's not an if. It's not maybe. It's a must. You must continue to develop into the person that you're called to be, into the person that you want to be, into the person that you strive to be. You can't get there without development. But the question I guess we're saying is, can you do that in a vacuum when it comes to your marriage? So
I mean, you can. Probably not gonna work out for the total picture, right? I mean, that's I think what I tried to do. I found myself focusing on only a couple different needs and not all of the needs, right? It was, I need to be better at work. I need to be better in my business. Okay, let's work on that. I started reading books, right? And just went crazily down that rabbit hole. And it led me into trying very hard. Okay. And when you try very hard at something, you typically pour all of yourself into it. So I'm sure there's men listening who have been in the same boat where you poured all of yourself into work and you become that guy who, I don't know if doesn't mind being at work, but in my perspective, typically when I'm working on something, I'm very interested in it. And, it keeps me engaged. So maybe it doesn't necessarily feel like work so much anymore. And then, on the back end, you have your wife saying, where are you? Right. And that can mean a couple different things, because what I'm also thinking about in this moment is if I'm sitting on a couch next to my wife and I'm still thinking about work, where are you? Like, where's your head at? Why aren't you engaging with me? But, enough about me. What's your perspective on the situation?
Before once you started talking, I was thinking, what I hear you saying is the development of me, right? It was all I statements. I need to do this. I need to do this. The I forgets about the we,
Right.
which is really a significant part of your life. Yeah, we spend a lot of time at work and working, but even if we don't spend time, right? Like if the time doesn't add up between work and sleep, the same amount of time with your kids and family, like that's a big weight on your shoulders. There's value to it, and it's always in the back of your mind whether you want to lean into it or not. So I was just hearing that and pointing out that it was there wasn't a there wasn't like a unity on that. Um, and sometimes all that takes is just a discussion of, I think, you know, I need to be better at this in my business, but having that discussion with your wife. Like, what do you think? Is this an area that you think we should do? And then in that conversation comes up, what, how much time will that be? So that then there's setting expectations. Then there's the level of priorities within that, and you get to break down and really come alongside. She comes alongside you in that space. That was my
Yeah.
thoughts for what you were saying.
Yeah. It makes it sound like there's, excuse me, no consideration for family life, right? But that's not the case. I think as men, especially as like a go getter, you kind of, I'll say, get confused, right?
Hmm.
You convince yourself that everything that I'm doing is for the family, but we're still behaving in a selfish manner, right? I think, and I'll even say, or go as far to say, a lot of men, myself included, felt like I needed to behave in that manner to become the man that my wife wants. Does that make sense? Right? Like I know now though that I had this this preconceived notion of what it is to be a man and husband, and I was steadily trying to fulfill that without even speaking to my wife about what it
That
is
part,
she wanted me to be or who she needed me to be.
yeah, that's the important part is, yeah, we have to remind ourselves, like, we think we know what we want our wife, what we want to be to our wives, without asking, hey, what do you want us to be?
Right.
And if we would just ask, then we could put all of our efforts into that instead of into the efforts of this avatar that we think she wants.
Mhm.
That's a
Yeah.
very good point.
Yeah. If you really dive a little bit deeper into it, what that means is we're catering more to our self perception and the outside perception, right?
Mm,
Because we get a lot of accolades when we're working that hard outside of the home, right? Oh, Brian's such a hard worker. He's go getter. He's got a full time job. He's got a business. Like, man, he's really got it all together. Nah, bro, certainly don't. My wife's over here crying because I'm not here to help with the family.
right.
She's crying because she doesn't feel loved because I'm just not here. And it feels to her that I'm not considering her in whatever moves I'm making. Does she feel like I'm trying to make these moves without her so I can be without her? Right. And that can come
Mm,
in two different forms, right? Be without her just for the day. Like I need space from her. Right.
mhm.
Or am I trying to make moves where I can advance myself where I no longer need her? All these considerations I could imagine my wife having because we're not having conversations about our relational growth, right? Brian becomes a better quote unquote man, but how does she perceive a man, right? Is a man someone who holds it down outside of the family, right? Holds it down at work, but then comes home and doesn't talk to her, is too exhausted to help around the house with little things, right? And then, just habitually kisses her on the cheek, right? Showers, rolls into bed, then rolls back out the next day, and we don't talk for another 16 hours, or you know what I mean? Like, it's I was being very selfish, and this is just me speaking from personal experience. Um, I'm I would hope that my wife thinks I'm much better now. I know that to be the case, but uh, it was difficult to pull myself back from there, from that space, because we would fight about, well, it started because we weren't having conversations, right? But then we would land in having fights about what her perspective was compared to mine. And rather than learning to speak to each other and receive what each other's perspectives were, we were just holding our ground and defending our perspective, which was not healthy for our relationship. I've said a lot.
No, that was all good. I mean, to speak from that space, yes, you're growing as a business person. Yes, you're growing as a communicator outside of the house. Yes, you were growing to meet the needs of those things that you needed outside, which are all good in itself, right? It's all positive in itself. It's growth in that way, but it's not growing together with your wife. It's more growing apart.
Mm,
And that's something we always have to consider as husbands. Yeah, like you said, that lie that I'm doing this for the family. But if she doesn't want you to grow in that way, or doesn't understand even why you're growing in that way, right?
right.
If it's that far, like, then it doesn't work. I mean, I think personal growth is good and needed, but I think it has to, or I would say the best personal growth is one that informs all aspects of your life, not just one. And even considering business growth, it's like, how can I grow? How can I use that everywhere? How can I be
Mhm.
better everywhere? And it might take some adjustments and the little tweaks, right? Obviously, the way you speak to people, like you can't speak to your family sometimes. And um, with the curtness and the matter of factness of things, especially your wife will probably have pushback based on the blind spots that you have that you don't see, or the things that you don't want to see, right? So, um, my thought is personal growth is good, but I think relational growth, a la- relational growth, when you grow together with your wife, that automatically bleeds over into your personal growth. Personal growth, I feel like, takes effort to bleed over into your marriage. Um, and the reason I say that is this, right? If me and my wife are working on my communication, how I speak to her actually does work how I speak to others,
Mhm.
because there's a careness, a kindness, a consideration that I have for her that I don't have for others innately. But if I learn how to pull that out and pick that out, I can now see that easier in other people. But if I'm communicating in business, it's more so, how can I get this done and what are the objectives that I need? There's
Mhm.
not necessarily a care factor unless that's a part of who you are, right? But if I learn how to do that in marriage, I can pick the pieces that I need to do that outside. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, we've talked a lot about the issues, right? And it leads me to talk about maybe some of the changes I've made,
Hmm.
because I could imagine, being a listener to this and say, all right, yeah, I mean, you called me out. I'm feeling some type of way now, but what do I do? Right.
Right, right, right.
Um, and so just some of the changes that I have started working on and am experiencing. Uh, Number one, it was just working on communication with my wife, right? And the communication that we've worked on is, number one for me, and at least, is being able to use quote unquote feeling words, um, which opened up my ability to kind of speak my wife's language. Okay. Um, but more than anything, it was the ability to speak in a manner where we could receive each other, right? When we hadn't been working on this together, we would get into areas of contention. And like I said previously, kind of just stand our ground on what our perception was of the situation. And no one was giving, right? And now we've learned to speak in a manner where she can hear me, I can hear her, our feelings are heard, and, you know, not automatically, but if you are working on that, you're able to show that you care about what the other person is saying. And then you start working on, developing a plan on meeting those needs, right? So with that, what I've been able to hear my wife say is that, and you'll hear me say this a lot on the podcast if you've been listening, she needed me at home more. So I started pulling myself out of the business more. And in my self development of becoming a better business owner, I learned how to do that and not lose any ground, right?
Hmm.
I started to understand that in order for my business to grow, I needed to hire people, and it wasn't me who needed to be doing the work in the field. Okay. And without, said employees, I was going to be stuck where I was, right? Stuck in the size of my business and stuck being away from home. And then even past that, I found more in self development how to increase my income at my main job, where now I will no longer have a need to have the business. And, along my path, I've been speaking to my wife. Hey, I'd like to do this. What are your thoughts on that? And what I found is rather than saying to me, hey, that sounds great, that will serve exactly what I need, and that's all I'm concerned about, it was more, are you sure that's what you want to do? Right. So now there's a concern on her part for my welfare. Like, am I going to regret making these decisions? Am I going to resent her for having to make these decisions? But now that we've talked them out and I have, been asked by her a couple times the same questions, but have leaned to the same answer every time, she feels a lot more comfortable with me making the moves that I am and more comfortable, that these are going to be the right steps for our family.
Yeah, um, that's good. I think that's good advice, right, for someone who may be leaning on the side of I'm doing a lot of personal growth without including my wife, like how to bring it around. Because I love what you said about, speaking in a manner in which you guys can receive each other helps communicate what you've been doing. But then it's like, okay, now that I've grown, right, we can spin the positive here. Now that I've grown, how do I use what I've made to help aid in what we need as a unit?
Mhm.
Right. So it's not like now that you're stuck, it's like, oh, I've learned all this stuff. I just abandon it. No, like use what you've learned. Like don't just go learning, learning, learning for the sake of it, but now use what you've learned for the good of your marriage.
Yeah.
And that definitely gives worth to what you've done because it was always there. But now it kind of brings it together. And you can present that to your wife, like for the betterment of your marriage. So yeah, I think that's awesome. Um, for the sake of relational development, I think some things that I did um, was I had to acknowledge that I wanted to grow in that space with someone because sometimes it can be a challenge, right? Like sometimes it's innate. Like obviously, if you're you're married and you're doing things together, like say you're working on a house project or something you're doing that involves a family, like you're both trying to get everything together. But to make intentional time to say, hey, we need to work on our communication. Let's check this book out. Let's walk through this book together. Let's go see a coach or a therapist, right? Let's um, lean into some people that can, point out the good and where we're going in our relationship, but, is also safe enough to show where they think we need to grow. Because sometimes the inside perspective is all roses and butterflies, but the outside perspective may see things that we don't A, want to address, or B, see that we need to address. So I think growing relationally can look a little different than personal growth because you have to consider how to get the data to improve, right? Some things are obvious. Like if you guys are fighting all the time, your communication stinks and one of you is always feeling unheard or unseen, you need growth in your communication.
Right.
But if your communication's solid, then it's like, okay, what else can we improve on? I think another way you can work is kind of quote unquote mentoring each other, right?
Mm.
Seeing the strong traits that your spouse has, and if that's something that you may be weaker or need a little bit more work, really just sitting and giving them a space to teach you, show you examples. Um, so like say if it's conversational, like you don't like to talk a lot and maybe your spouse does, you know, once you're in a social setting, like really pay attention to what he or she does and then come back and say, hey, I saw when we were talking, like, how did you make that conversation flow? Like, it just seemed like it was real easy. It's a little harder for me to do that. Like, what are some things you do or think about? Right. And then be able to teach or be taught. And that's something of you coming together. And that way, your spouse, maybe next time you're out, she can lean into a space to say, like, all right, when next time we're out, like, I'll start a conversation and I'll just stop and let you kind of continue it and pick up, or I'll give you this code word or this phrase and you take it and you start talking. And then you're growing together. And it's something that you both win at as a unit.
Yeah, that's good. Um, that's that's funny because I just had the thought that for a long time I struggled speaking to my wife. Right, it was especially when I was really heavy into only my personal growth and not our relationship growth. Right. Um, I was deep into a lot of books and I was, reading and listening to books at a, voracious volume, really. And I found myself kind of stuck there thinking about the next book I wanted to get into, right? But I wasn't thinking like I really need to get into a conversation with my wife. But I was also feeling like I didn't have anything to talk to her about. Now we have a world of experiences, a world of issues and, successes that we could have been speaking about, plans to make and, that type of thing. But I was simply focused on my next project.
Mm.
And so I would sit here kind of just stuck in my head, could even like look to the left or right, wherever she was, and notice that she was, desiring a conversation, but I felt like I didn't have anything to say, you know, and it was messed up because we could go out together to a wedding or whatever, see mutual friends, and I could instantly strike up conversations with the men because I think I was looking for acknowledgement of the things I was working on and just reflecting. I don't know that I was necessarily getting that at home. Right. So now we're in a public space and I'm feeling respected and acknowledged and, you know, speaking to people who have similar interests. And I couldn't get there at home because we hadn't talked from the beginning to where I was now about those things. I just didn't include her.
Yeah, that's so interesting because we just using that example, could it be, and we can have a conversation about this, could it be right? You were doing all these things that you wanted to do and that you thought made you a good man, and you can present those and get that acknowledgement, but that wasn't necessarily what Katie cared about. So you wouldn't necessarily get those accolades and that pat on the back, that attaboy, because that wasn't serving the need that served you as a unit or your family best in her eyes.
Mhm. Yeah,
So you were missing that because she could never give that to you because you didn't have the conversations about it.
right, and that's what I was gonna say, to compound it, is I couldn't at that time, and I don't even know that I consciously knew this. I couldn't express to her those were the feelings I was having or that was something that I needed from her. Because all of my life, I knew I could get that in other places very readily. So maybe to some extent, I felt that maybe I don't need that from her because I can go outside the home and
Mhm.
just get that, right? I could perform at work, I can talk to friends, other men, I a random stranger. I could strike up a conversation with and like, what do you do for work? Oh, this is what I do for work. And blah blah blah. It just goes from there. Um, but I think in hindsight, if I had communicated that to her and gave her the capability to fill my bucket, feed me in that manner, however you want to state it, I would have been more ready, I would have more readily had those conversations with her about what I would like to do, how I thought that it might serve the family, and then given her an opportunity to ask questions, give feedback, and really even just check me where in some areas, she may have seen that that's not going to work,
Mhm.
because I've seen in areas where I thought, hey, this is going to be very good for me, my career path, I'm going to grow. And it's set our family back, right? It's it's wild to say out loud.
Yeah. Self-awareness and looking back is hindsight, and to know that you're not there now
Hmm.
is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? To be able to lean back on those experiences, and I mean, I think it gives us a chance to even apologize for those things that we've done if we haven't yet, right? So, to all listeners, if you realize there's something that you may have done or not considered, it's never too late to acknowledge that that was the case. Um, Even if you move past it, but it's good to acknowledge that it did happen, um, so that your spouse sees that you are doing some thinking and some considering of them, even if she's like, "Boy, I've been forgiving you for that," right? But
Mhm.
it's the sentiment of seeing her and caring and understanding that you weren't giving her your best at that moment with what you were given, but you now see that you can give better and do better, and hopefully you are. So,
Yeah. I want to leave one last nugget, and that is don't be afraid to ask for what you need. I got to an area where I found out through our conversations that all I really wanted was to hear that my wife was proud of what I had done. Okay, so I'm gonna let that sink in for a second. All I wanted to know is that she was proud of me. I'd worked very hard to become the man that I am, right? And again, I talk about, the respect and the accolades that I would get outside of the home. I needed to know that that's the way she felt. She could display that non-verbally, and I could feel it and understand it, but I also wanted to hear it. Okay. And I think too many times humans feel like, well, I shouldn't have to ask, right? If you really felt that way, you would just say it. Well, that's not always the case. And I'm sure you could look internally and feel and realize that you haven't done that in some areas as well. So don't feel it to be a sign of weakness or a sign of your spouse not being the support you think that they should be if you haven't told them this is how I would like, you know, to feel and for you to speak to me. Because if they don't know, they don't know.
That's good. Communication is key. Verbal communication is
Right.
key because we're always communicating, but verbally communicating is key. And that way they can give what you need and you can give what they need. That's perfect. Well, on that note, go ahead and just say, I hope you appreciated this conversation. Hope that there was a nugget you could take from it. If so, please share this content, like it if you deem so. Again, check us out on all our socials: Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Hit us up on our website, Marriage is Tougher. You can find us anywhere searching Marriage is Tougher. But yeah, marriagestougher.com if you want to be a guest. You see all of our episodes there. We're also on all podcast platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, you name it. And again, you can reach us at our website. So thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.
Peace.